The leather seat felt cold against Marcus Wellington's back as he settled into his first-class cabin, exhaustion weighing on every muscle. At 42, he'd built an empire from nothing, $300 million, countless properties, and a reputation that made boardrooms tremble. Yet tonight, flying home from another grueling acquisition deal, he felt older than his years. The champagne sat untouched beside him as passengers filed past, their eyes lingering on his custom suit and gold watch. He'd grown accustomed to those looks, the mixture of envy, curiosity, and judgment. What they didn't see were the sleepless nights, the family dinners missed, the relationships sacrificed at the altar of success. As the flight attendant began closing the cabin door, a commotion erupted near the entrance. Marcus glanced up to see a young woman in a threadbare coat struggling with a small rolling suitcase, a child's hand clutched firmly in hers. The little girl couldn't have been more than 5, with wild dark curls escaping from beneath a knitted cap that had seen better days. Her coat was too thin for the October cold, patched at the elbows with mismatched fabric. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but your seats are in coach," the flight attendant said, her tone professional but firm. The woman's cheeks flushed crimson. "I know, the bathroom back there has a line, and my daughter really needs to." "There's a restroom in the back of the economy section as well," the attendant interrupted, already gesturing toward the rear of the plane. Marcus watched the exchange with detached interest, noting how the woman's shoulders sagged in defeat. But it was the child who caught his attention. While her mother apologized profusely, the little girl stood perfectly still, her enormous brown eyes taking in everything around her with wonder. When those eyes landed on Marcus, she smiled, not the practiced, wanting smile of a child seeking something, but a genuine beam of pure warmth that seemed to light up her entire face. Something twisted in Marcus's chest. He turned away, closing his eyes as the pair disappeared toward the back of the plane. He'd learned long ago not to get involved in other people's problems. Compassion was a luxury he couldn't afford in business, and that philosophy had served him well. The flight took off smoothly, and Marcus reclined his seat, determined to sleep through the 5-hour journey to New York. But sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept returning to that little girl's smile, so full of innocence and joy despite her worn clothing and obvious poverty. He shifted uncomfortably, finally settling into a position facing the aisle, his eyes closed but his mind racing with acquisition strategies and quarterly projections. He must have dozed off eventually because he was jolted to semi-consciousness by a small sound near his seat. Marcus kept his eyes shut, curious about what had disturbed him. Through his lashes, he could barely make out a tiny figure standing in the aisle beside him. It was the little girl from earlier. Marcus remained perfectly still, his breathing slow and even, watching through barely opened eyes. What was she doing up here? Was she lost, looking for the bathroom again? But the child didn't move past him. Instead, she stood there for a long moment, simply observing him. Then, with careful, deliberate movements, she reached up and began tucking the airplane blanket more snugly around his shoulders. Her small hands worked with surprising gentleness, patting the edges down to ensure no draft could reach him. Marcus's heart began to pound. What was happening? The little girl paused, seeming satisfied with her work. But she didn't leave. Instead, she carefully removed her own thin jacket, the patched one he'd noticed earlier, and laid it gently across his feet, which were extending slightly beyond the blanket's reach. Marcus felt his throat constrict. His feet were covered by $1,000 Italian leather shoes, tucked under pants that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And this child, who clearly had nothing, who was probably cold herself in the airplane's air-conditioned cabin, was giving him her only jacket. Through his barely open eyes, he watched as she stepped back to admire her handiwork. She nodded to herself, apparently pleased that the sleeping stranger would be warm. Then she did something that shattered every wall Marcus had built around his heart over 2 decades of cutthroat business. The little girl leaned forward and whispered, so softly he almost didn't hear, "My mommy says when people sleep on airplanes, it means they're very tired from working hard. Sleep good, mister. I hope your dreams are happy." Then she turned and began making her way back toward economy class, her small frame disappearing down the aisle. Marcus lay frozen, his eyes squeezed shut now to hold back the burning sensation building behind them. When had anyone last cared about his comfort? When had anyone last wished him happy dreams? His ex-wife had left 3 years ago, tired of being married to a man who loved his company more than his family. His own children, now teenagers, barely spoke to him during their mandated visits. His friends were business associates who wanted something from him. His employees feared him. And a 5-year-old girl with nothing to her name had just shown him more genuine kindness than he'd experienced in years. He sat up abruptly, the expensive blanket falling away. The flight attendant approached with concern, but Marcus waved her off, his eyes searching the aisle. He grabbed the small, patched jacket from his feet and stood, making his way toward the back of the plane. The economy section was a different world, cramped, loud, and filled with the smell of recycled air and instant coffee. He found them in row 32. The mother had her head back against the seat, eyes closed in exhaustion. The little girl sat by the window, now wearing only a thin long-sleeved shirt, her arms wrapped around herself as she gazed out at the clouds. Marcus stood there for a moment, this jacket, worth maybe $10 at a thrift store, clutched in his hands like the most precious thing he'd ever held. Because in that moment, it was. "Excuse me," he said softly. The woman's eyes flew open, instantly alert and worried when she saw him standing there. "I'm so sorry, did Emma bother you? I told her to stay in her seat." "Emma," Marcus said, testing the name. He looked at the little girl, who had turned from the window and was now watching him with those enormous, guileless eyes. "Is that your name?" She nodded shyly. Marcus knelt down in the aisle, ignoring the other passengers craning their necks to see what was happening. He held out the jacket. "You forgot this." Emma's eyes widened. "But you were cold. Your feet were sticking out." Marcus found his voice catching. "I wasn't really asleep, Emma. I was pretending. And I saw what you did." The little girl's face fell. "Oh, I'm sorry. Mommy says I should mind my own business, but you looked so tired and—" "Please don't apologize," Marcus interrupted gently. "What you did was the kindest thing anyone has done for me in a very long time. Maybe ever." The mother was watching now with confusion and growing concern, clearly trying to understand why a first-class passenger was kneeling in the aisle talking to her daughter. Marcus stood, extending his hand to the woman. "My name is Marcus Wellington. And your daughter just taught me something I should have learned a long time ago." He paused, feeling emotions he'd buried for decades threatening to surface. "I'd like to know your story, if you'll share it. And I'd like to help, if you'll let me." Over the next hour, sitting in those cramped economy seats after insisting the mother and daughter take his first-class accommodations, Marcus learned about Sarah and Emma Chen. Sarah was a nurse traveling to New York to start over after her husband's death in a construction accident 2 years prior. She'd scraped together everything she had for these tickets and first month's rent on a tiny apartment in Queens, hoping the city's better hospitals would offer more opportunities. Emma, despite their hardships, was described by her mother as relentlessly compassionate, always sharing her lunch with kids who had none, always stopping to pet stray dogs, always making cards for the elderly neighbor who had no family. "I don't know where she gets it from," Sarah said with a tearful laugh. "I'm so tired and stressed all the time, I feel like I have nothing left to give. But Emma, she sees someone who needs something, and she just gives. Last week she donated her favorite stuffed animal to the charity drive at school because another little girl was crying." Marcus listened, and with every word, he felt something fundamental shifting inside him. Here was a child who had every reason to be bitter, angry, or selfish, yet she moved through the world dispensing kindness like it was the most natural thing imaginable. When they landed at JFK, Marcus made a call. Then another. By the time they reached baggage claim, he'd arranged for a car service, contacted a friend who managed luxury apartments in Manhattan, and set up a trust fund that would ensure Emma's education through graduate school. Sarah initially refused, overwhelmed and suspicious of strings that might be attached. But Marcus looked her in the eye and said something he'd never expected to hear himself say, "Your daughter gave me her jacket when she thought I was cold. She had every reason to walk past me. I'm a stranger, someone from a different world, someone who probably wouldn't have even noticed her if our situations were reversed. But she saw another human being and responded with pure, uncomplicated kindness. Please, let me respond the same way." 6 months later, Marcus stood in Sarah's new apartment, not the one he'd initially arranged, but a comfortable place she'd chosen herself, one she could sustain with her new position at Mount Sinai Hospital, a job that had materialized after a strategic donation to their pediatric wing. Emma ran up to him immediately, now wearing a proper winter coat that fit her perfectly. But what struck Marcus wasn't the new clothes or the warmth of the apartment. It was the drawing she thrust into his hands, a crayon picture of an airplane with two stick figures, one tall and one small, holding hands. "That's you and me," she explained unnecessarily. "You're not sad anymore, right?" Marcus knelt down, his eyes level with hers. "No, Emma, I'm not sad anymore." And it was true. In the months since that flight, Marcus had restructured his entire life. He'd reconnected with his children, spending actual time with them rather than just sending money. He'd started a foundation focused on helping single parents like Sarah. He'd even begun volunteering at a children's hospital every Tuesday, reading stories to sick kids. His business hadn't suffered. In fact, his employees reported that he'd become easier to work with, more understanding, more human. Productivity had actually increased. But the real change was internal. Marcus had spent 20 years building walls, believing that distance and detachment were necessary for success. A 5-year-old girl with a patched jacket had demolished those walls in one selfless gesture, revealing a simple truth he'd forgotten: kindness isn't weakness. Compassion isn't a luxury. Humanity isn't something to be sacrificed for success, it's the very foundation upon which meaningful success should be built. As he left the apartment that evening, Emma called out from the doorway, "Mr. Marcus, are your dreams happy now?" He turned back, smiling, a real smile that reached his eyes, something his own reflection had barely recognized in recent months. "Yes, Emma, my dreams are very happy now." Walking into the cold New York night, Marcus Wellington finally understood what it meant to be truly rich. And it had nothing to do with the numbers in his bank account.